You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Today, we are continuing our sub-series on Native American women. Listeners will recall that it began with Louise McDonnell and Jonelle Beauvais on traditional Native female leadership, and then moved on to Rebecca Nagel and Crystal Echohawk on a statistical study of the ways in which Native women have been imaged and portrayed. Then we did a panel on Indigenous American women visual artists, and then an interview with the author Cherie Moraga, discussing Indigenous Chicana women. Today, we have with us one of the founding board members of the Women's Media Center, Cristina Azocar, the distinguished Native American Mattaponi journalist, who's here to discuss her new book, The News Media and the Indigenous Fight for Federal Recognition. Now, did you ever wonder why certain immigrant communities, and obviously the Native community is not one of them, but certain immigrant communities seemed to specialize in certain particular jobs as they tried to settle into their new nation? Did you ever wonder why? Well, the answers don't reside simply in stereotyping. They run much deeper. They're complex. For example, Chinese men had been, quote, recruited as cheap labor to build the railroads. But the Page Act of 1875 barred Chinese women from entering the United States because it was assumed they would all be prostituted women. Yet, when they finally were permitted to come, they brought with them the centrality to Chinese culture of food and housekeeping. Therefore, such communities began working in restaurants and laundries, and eventually saved enough to begin owning them as a measure, although a very small one, of economic independence. But have you ever wondered why and how the indigenous peoples of this country, again, most assuredly not immigrants, came to be so associated with, of all things, gaming casinos? Well, stay tuned and you'll discover a fascinating story about both external manipulation and organic development. But first, we need to go inside the headlines. I want to cover some news items that have tended to slip into the cracks in previous episodes of this sub-series. Some are quite dispiriting, I warn you, but others are very heartening. And the heartening parts are simply the result of having more Native people, women in particular, in positions of relative power. Surprise! For instance, having Deb Haaland, a former guest on this program, as the first Native American cabinet secretary in the United States ever. She's Secretary of the Interior. She has land. That's directly traceable to the initial investigation that she commissioned that cataloged some of the brutal conditions Native children had endured at more than 400 boarding schools the federal government forced them to attend between 1819 and 1969. Go, Deb. Also, the Environmental Protection Agency announced recently that it would seek to return authority to states to oppose gas pipelines, coal terminals, and other projects that pose a threat to lakes, rivers, and streams, thus reversing a major Trump administration rule. The EPA is seeking to restore states' authority, giving local officials, including Native American nations, more ability to scrutinize proposals to build many highways, hydroelectric dams, shopping malls, housing developments, and wineries and breweries. To our north, Canadian officials reached $31.5 billion in agreements in principle with Indigenous groups to compensate First Nations children who were unnecessarily torn from their homes and put into the child welfare system. This is a major development in a dispute that has long been a sticking point in Ottawa's efforts to advance reconciliation with Indigenous people. Now, Native women have been trying to bring this next story to light since the 1970s, but it only broke the surface finally, really, in the last 4 or 5 years. Native women were the targets of the modern form of genocide, sterilization. Over the 6-year period that followed passage of the Family Planning, Service, and Population Research Act of 1970, physicians sterilized as much as 25% of all Native American women of childbearing age, and evidence suggests that the numbers were actually even higher. Some of these procedures were performed under pressure or duress or without the woman's knowledge or understanding. Now, we know that Black and Latina women were targets of coercive sterilization in these years, but this law also subsidized sterilization for patients who received their health care through the Indian Health Service and for Medicaid patients. Furthermore, Native women's reproductive autonomy has been constrained in other ways. Since the late 1970s, the Hyde Amendment has prohibited federal funding for abortion services, with very few exceptions. The amendment hinders the ability of all low-income women to terminate a pregnancy, and it disproportionately affects women of color. But it discriminates against Native women specifically because they are entitled to receive health services from a federal agency. And I'll close with 2 items about Indigenous people's consciousness of just how their images are being manipulated, co-opted, appropriated, and marketed. One example I personally like is historical. Inspired by the matriarchal and matrilineal traditions of Native women in the great Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the suffragists, who were largely white and of European ancestry, often invited Native women to speak at their meetings, and the women accepted because it was a chance to educate their audiences. The organizers then asked Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, to assemble a float for the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington. The organizers wanted the float to portray Native women as they had been in the past, wearing buckskin, with their hair in braids, that sort of thing. Well, Baldwin, who was quite aware of the power of imagery in shaping perception, pondered this strategically, and she decided not to organize the float, and instead marched with her classmates and teachers from the Washington College of Law, making a statement that Native women were modern new women looking to the future. Baldwin was one of the first Native women to graduate from law school in 1914. We should know her name. And last but hardly least, because it is media, and it will have an effect on perception, particularly, but not exclusively, of the young. Iron Circus Comics is launching a Kickstarter campaign for the anthology called The Woman and the Woods and Other North American Stories. This is an all-new anthology of comics inspired by original North American folktales, and it contains more than 100 pages of entertaining educational stories by artists and writers from Indigenous people across the continent. And for updates, you can follow Iron Circus Books on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We have to pause here for a brief break, but then we'll return right away with Cristina Azocar. Stay tuned. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
My guest for the conversation today is Dr. Cristina Azocar. She is a citizen of the Upper Mattaponi Indian tribe and a professor of journalism at San Francisco State University. She's the author of News Media and the Indigenous Fight for Federal Recognition from Lexington Books. Dr. Azocar is the faculty coordinator of the Presidential Scholars Program, the most prestigious scholarship offered at SF State, and she's the faculty advisor to the Student Council of Intertribal Nations. Her research focuses on the intersection of race and journalistic practice, much needed, I might add, particularly in the area of news coverage of Indigenous people. Azocar earned her doctorate in communication studies at the University of Michigan. She holds a master's degree in ethnic studies and a bachelor's degree in journalism, both from San Francisco State University. Her interest in diversity in the news media spans more than 30 years. She served as a past president of the Native American Journalists Association, directed the Center for Integration and Improvement of Journalism for 10 years, was a former editor of American Indian Issues for the Media Diversity Forum, and was an inaugural board member of the Women's Media Center. She and Assistant Professor Lourdes Cardenas were awarded the 2021 Distinguished Service to Journalism from the NorCal Society of Professional Journalists for creating the bilingual Spanish journalism degree, only one of 2 degrees of its kind in the United States, and the only one at a public university. It gives me great pleasure to welcome an old friend and colleague. Cristina, welcome to Women's Media Center Live.
Thank you so much, Robin. It is so good to talk to you after a very long time. We have a long relationship.
Well, we're here to talk about your new book, which is News Media and the Indigenous Fight for Federal Recognition. And boy, is it a big fight. So why don't you start and take it away and talk about how the book came to be, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. And again, thank you. So I'm a citizen of the Upper Mattaponi tribe, which is located on the lands currently occupied by the state of Virginia. So if you think about Virginia, the destruction of our indigenous communities really began in the 1600s.
Yeah.
So the Upper Mattaponi and other tribes in the area that are still in the area were considered part of the Powhatan Confederacy. And so listeners may have heard of the famous person, Pocahontas. Well, Pocahontas was the daughter of John Smith. I'm sorry, she was the daughter of Powhatan, and she was coerced into marrying John Smith. So people say, she married him. I'm sure she was coerced into marrying him and not marrying him of her free will.
Yeah.
So John Smith was the James guy. And so Pocahontas was Pamunkey, so Pamunkey Indian. And the Pamunkey tribe is a tribe very close to us. So if you look at the book, if you get the book, there's a map on page 76, and you can see where that was. So if you think about this idea of federal recognition, our tribe and the tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy were tribes that myths about Indians were founded on. But the government, the United States government, did not recognize us until a sovereign nation in 2018. And so this was
that late.
Fight.
Wow.
That is late. So we have 1646. We made a treaty with the English colonizers, but yet the U.S. government took until 2018 to recognize us. And so basically, federal recognition means that the United States government has a trust duty to tribes. And so the federal government promised tribes that it would provide education and health to tribal people. And this is a super important part, it would protect us from American settlers.
Ha.
So federal recognition acknowledges that tribes have the right of self-determination. And what people say is that, the government gives federal recognition. No, it doesn't give federal recognition. It acknowledges the existence of a sovereign relationship with a tribe.
Yes, which
And
has
so
been, and which that in itself, that those treaties have been violated again and again and again and again. But at least they existed to point to at least that. Go on. It's fascinating.
Right. So, yes, treaty, and there is no treaty that has not been broken.
Yeah.
So since my tribe in the Upper Mattaponi we were state recognized by the state of Virginia, but that doesn't really do much. So in order to really have this sovereign relationship, and the sovereignty really gives tribes the ability to take care of citizens. Right? So it gives us access to health funds, education funds, different, and now COVID funds to take care of our people. So it's an important important relationship to have with the government.
Yeah.
But so I'm a journalism professor, and I was speaking in 2005 to a group of journalists with my uncle Kenny. So Kenneth Adams, was chief of the Upper Mattaponi tribe at the time. And him and I were doing this talk when the National Museum of the American Indian had just opened in D.C. And we were speaking to a group of journalists along with a member of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs exists in the Department of the Interior, and the Department of the Interior also has within it the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, which is the office that recognizes tribes. So
God save us from bureaucracy. Although it's very comforting that Deb Haaland, who of course is Native American, is the very first person cabinet member to ever head Department of the Interior, which is, in other words, it's land. So that and the appointment of Joy Harjo as poet laureate have made my year.
And I think that they also signal changes. Like real substantive changes, and hopefully they signal substantive changes in the bureaucracy, because there was, what did I mention, 3 or 4 different agencies in one sentence dealing with.
Yeah, that's right, nested in each other. Yeah,
small part of federal Indian law, really, and federal Indian law is super, super complicated. So my uncle and I were talking to this group of journalists about the federal recognition process. And I don't exactly remember what the context of it was. And it was something that at that point, I did not realize until I started writing this book that I had absolutely no clue about. But so the Bureau of Indian Affairs was talking about what tribes have to collect in order to receive this federal recognition, in order to gain this relationship, to qualify. And so part of the process is documentation. So you have to have lots of documentation.
What if you don't have a written tradition?
Well, exactly. So the government at that time required tribes to go back. I can't remember exact date. I think it was maybe 1850 or something. The law changed in 2015, and so the BIA person had this box of documents to illustrate a good record-keeping collection for tribes. And so my uncle, he's looking at the documents, and he kicks me under the table, and he said, "Those are our documents." And so this was 2005. But it wasn't until 2018 that we got acknowledged, and not through the Bureau of Indian Affairs federal acknowledgement process, but through an act of Congress. So one of the things that tribes have to do is collect all of this information, and it's historical document. It's information that shows that the tribes have continued to exist. Now in 2015, the criteria changed, and so it became 1900 instead of before 1900. So tribes only have to show this continuity of existence basically from 1900, and yet part of what I go into in the book is this idea of paper genocide.
Fascinating. In
1924 in Virginia, there was this act called the Racial Integrity Act. And this guy named Walter Plucker got rid of all Indians through an act of basically a signature. So he took the Racial Integrity Act, got rid of all Indians, changed all birth certificates to either white or colored. So depending on how dark you were no longer Indian, you were white or colored. And so tribes have to show continuity of being Indians, but we couldn't because in 1924, all Indians were gone.
Yeah, you just waved a wand and poof, you disappeared.
Waved a wand, and so this tribes are supposed to go through this process of showing this continuity, but they can't because of things like the Racial Integrity Act, because of the census, the U.S. Census, which didn't count Indians until 1850, and now lots of people don't want to be counted because of the association of what's going to happen if they know that we're here, right? They might try to get rid of
God.
And so what my tribe ended up doing was going through an act of Congress. So we had to get senators and representatives to go to bat for us and push for federal recognition. And what happens is every 2 years, there's a new Congress that gets seated.
Yeah, sure.
You start, and then you have to start it all over again.
Yeah, isn't that fun?
And then, ironically, friend of the Indian, Donald Trump, is the one who signed it to law finally in 2018. People just don't understand how expensive the process is.
Sure.
It takes tribes money to collect information, to hire anthropologists, historians, if they can't get a local university to basically, be the people for them. But university folks come and go too, and their interests wax and wane. So,
this is a huge research project. Of course, it costs money.
Right. I have some examples in the book of the cost of the process, and just about how long it takes things to get moving.
Yeah, I have a theory. I have a theory, Cristina, about why Virginia has been such a problem for the Mattaponi. Because, of course, it was the stamping ground of so many of the framers. We have Jefferson there. We have Washington there. We have Madison there. We have Patrick Henry, the bastard, there. And they had their plantations there, and they had their enslaved people there, all on Mattaponi land, it now turns out. So they would have been less willing to give the land right under their feet out than somewhere else in the colonies. Perhaps. Maybe that's just paranoid of me, but that's a theory.
That is a theory. I am pretty impressed that we survived it.
Yeah.
We are still there. We were never removed. I think that, in particular in 1924, when Walter Plecker said, "Oh, there aren't any more Indians," they said, "Oh, great, we don't have to deal with them anymore."
That's right.
And you mentioned just in terms of the framers. So a lot of people don't know that the formation of the U.S. was inspired by the Haudenosaunee.
That's right.
Great Law.
Yeah, we've talked about that. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Great Law,
Right.
And the women who controlled so much of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and how that impressed Ben Franklin, and how it impressed some of the other framers, and how it later on impressed the suffragists who wanted to be like those women. But the two parts that got dropped from the imitation were enslavement of Black people and women. So there you go. So in the process of the government discovering or being forced to recategorize who your tribal people were, that is the kind of thing that you're covering in the book, as well as the news coverage of that process of recognition.
Right. So the second part of the story is after being with my uncle, Chief Adams, at the National Museum of American Indian. And the group of reporters was all these things happening in DC at that time, and so then I went with my uncle to a hearing it was with the Commission for Federal Indian Affairs, and at that time it was headed by John McCain, and this was part of the asking Congress for federal recognition. So again, having to go through an act of Congress instead of the federal acknowledgement process, because the federal acknowledgement process again requires tribes to have all of this documentation.
Yeah.
But if tribes cannot get the documentation, then the other process is through an act of Congress. And so John McCain at that meeting asked my uncle, he said, "Well, if you get federal recognition, are you going to open a casino?" And
oh God.
And I thought that was the strangest thing, because it's like, nobody has ever mentioned a casino. No, we were pretty strong Southern Baptists there in Virginia, and so at that time there was no consideration of having a casino. And I thought, why would John McCain ask this question?
Indeed.
So when I fast forward to 2018, actually I think it was about 2016, when I just kept hearing I think that our tribe, the traction was gaining momentum for federal recognition. And so I think I was just doing some research project, and I thought, I wonder if I just look and see what the news media coverage of the federal recognition process, what I'm going to find. And so I thought, well, I'm going to put in for a research grant. I need a sabbatical. So I decided I just want to look at the news media coverage of the federal recognition process. That was really the goal, just to do this kind of straight academic content analysis, take the body of stories that I could find on federal recognition and see what I come up with, see what these stories say. And so I had access to this database, and I looked at every available story in the database, actually 3 or 4 databases. I looked at LexisNexis and ProQuest, every story that I could find, and the earliest I could find was in the 80s. And of course, the latest was now, and there were fewer than 4,000 stories. So we have 40 years, right?
My
40
God.
years of possible stories, and yet there were fewer than 4,000, and there were only 21 broadcast stories. Like, that's radio. And this was so it was NPR mostly. There was a couple of really, really racist ones on 60 Minutes. One called Wampum Wampum Wonderland was just the most egregious.
My God! Oh my God!
And I thought, well, this is really interesting that really there hasn't been any coverage, and so the federal recognition process is invisible. Right?
Yeah.
Until we hit Cabazon. So in 1987, the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians opened a high-stakes bingo parlor near Palm Springs. And so this is when more coverage about tribes started happening, and the narrative shifts from what sovereignty is to it's not about sovereignty. It's if these tribes get federal recognition, then they're going to open a casino, and then all this crime and destruction is going to come into your communities.
Oh, that is an amazing scoop. That should have been front page news.
Yes.
I mean,
I agree.
This is where the journalist in you kicks in strong. Wow. That's amazing. Until they could find something which they could spin as negative, having negative impact. Their spin entirely, but nonetheless, it was something to grab onto. Until that was located, you were invisible, and then suddenly you became visible again.
So then I thought, well, how? I really wanted to examine this idea, right? I wanted to say, like, well, wait a minute, how true really is this too? Because since all the coverage was pointing this way, I wanted to look at and like why and how. And so I started. So originally, again, this is going to be a very straight research book, and then I decided that I really, in order to understand this, that I needed to talk to some people. So I called my uncle, again, Kenny Adams. He was no longer the chief, but I wanted to know what he thought about really what the process was, because he was in it for 15 years. He was the chief for 15 years. He was doing it. He was lobbying. It cost an enormous amount of money. And so I actually opened the book with a story from him about how my grandmother was the person who gave the first $20 to pay lobbyists for federal recognition. And so I think that's something that people don't realize too, is these costs, the lobbying costs.
Sure, of course.
And how crazy expensive it is. So if I could just read one paragraph.
Sure, go ahead.
About this. And this is in chapter 10 of the book. The chapter is called Perspectives from Native Journalists and Legal Experts. And so this is about the Little Shell tribe. So by 2007, the Native American Rights Fund had spent 29 years and more than 3,400 attorney hours on the federal recognition of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians of Montana. The cost at that time was already in excess of $1 million, including attorney time and the experts hired to do the technical work. It was finally recognized as part of the National Defense Authorization Act in 2020, but only after 12 years of Montana Senator John Tester introducing the bill each year beginning in 2007. So that's $1 million, right? That's $1 million over 29 years that this tribe had to spend. And so I think that there's this, casinos have made it take longer. So one of the people that I interviewed for the book, her name is Arlinda Locklear. She's the first licensed woman attorney, Native woman attorney, to try a case before a Supreme Court. She's Lumbee, and she is, everybody said, you got to talk to Arlinda, because Arlinda knows the federal recognition process in and out. And so I created a chapter based on my interview with her, and the chapter is called "Federal Recognition Does Not Equate to Casinos." And in this, she really runs through how difficult it is to actually get a casino. And so I'll read one more little paragraph that it's at the end of the chapter, and it sums it up. So Locklear succinctly described the complicated years-long process. First, you have to get the land, then you have to get the environmental impact statement, then you've got to get it placed into trust, and then you've got to get the Secretary of Interior to determine if that land is gaming eligible if it was acquired in trust after 1988. That's Cabazon year, remember.
Mm-hmm.
A tribe will then need to hire gaming lawyers if it wants a casino. For Class 3 gaming, it needs a compact with the state. Class 2 gaming, which consists of bingo and related games, including electronic versions of those games, can take place without a compact. But other laws and regulations need to be followed. Either way, it takes at least another year, and inevitably someone will stop to sue the gaming. Often, this is someone in Las Vegas.
There's something absolutely surreal about this in its hilarity. I mean that very grimly, in a context where, graveyards are being uncovered with indigenous infants buried in them, in the history of what was done to Native peoples in the Americas. There's this to reduce this to gaming, which, by the way, I always thought, maybe this was just very naive, was mostly in the Southwest. In and around Vegas and, in those places, maybe some in upstate New York. But to make that the central piece in Native businesses, communities' existence is bizarre.
So the one thing that happened during COVID is that a lot of tribes, casinos shut down.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what this realization is that tribes that had casinos
Uh-huh.
had more resources. Just let's take Donald Trump's casinos. So Donald Trump doesn't share the money from his casinos with his community, right?
Oh no.
So tribes, the money stays within the communities.
Yeah, clearly.
And so it has the ability to take care of its people when it has this income. Now, we also know that these are not, first of all, a lot of tribes that have casinos don't make a lot of money from them. So that's a misnomer. Most of the tribes aren't multi-billion-dollar industries, but it affords a sense of economic development, right?
Yeah.
And so other cultures and other people, other communities who have economic ventures don't get slighted because they've decided to open these potentially amoralistic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's this moral standard put on Native peoples. People are no longer happy with us because we're not in our place.
Yeah, clearly. And
no matter what.
And this was the one way in which you could even approximate, however vaguely, economic power. Why did it go in this direction? How did gaming get chosen if it were chosen, if it didn't choose you?
Well, so games have always been part of a lot of Indian cultures.
I see.
Bingo and just games in general, and it was sort of this natural evolution for people's like, oh, okay, well, we already do these types of things culturally. Let's just expand them into something that we can use to shore up our community economic
and make some money. Interesting.
And so there's actually a little bit in the book about where gaming came from. There's a little bit of a history, just because I also thought, well, part of what I tried to do in the book was whenever I thought somebody might have a question about how this came about, just like why game?
Of
why
course.
not something else?
Of course.
How did that enter into the conversation? And so I tried to include those stories in the book. So it also just, so it's sort of a weird mix of academic journalism and stories.
Well, stories you can't lose. I mean, stories are always a great thing. If media then emphasize this and primarily this or only this, that has shaped the image of the Indigenous community and the Indigenous individual ever since.
Right. And so if we're thinking about, well, I think I said part of what I wanted to do with the book is also give journalists some sort of guide. So just say, like, hey, it doesn't have to be like this. So journalists often, there's like when reporting on a community. Well, if you think about it, journalists aren't supposed to be reporting on communities. They're supposed to be reporting for communities.
Precisely.
And if you report for a community, then just the worldview of your journalistic premise should be different, right? Instead of starting at the point of already wanting to know why a tribe's going to get a casino, or how a tribe's going to get a casino, unless the tribe brings it up, then that shouldn't even be part of the conversation. Why is there? I found a lot of reporting where all of a sudden there's stories about, there's something in there about a casino, or even starts the casino when the tribe is specifically not ever mentioned a casino, or has specifically said, we're not interested in gaming. We're not close enough to a major hub of or a free that people could even come out here. So I this idea of reporting for a community, which is what's supposed to be what journalism is supposed to do. And so one of the things that I was looking at in another study when some colleagues and I were looking at how the use of casinos really was instrumental for tribes during COVID, like that kind of money, and how much loss occurred in those communities because of the loss of casino money. And so what I wanted what I want journalists to know is that the news media really doesn't have a historical perspective on federal recognition. They don't understand why non-federally recognized tribes exist, and they don't understand anything about gaming. And so I want this book, because it's not a long book, I want this book to be a primer, like you can pick it up. If you're a journalist, you can say, like, oh, well, how am I supposed to do this? I'm going to be covering a tribe seeking federal recognition. And so I just give some pointers, like basic pointers. And I think that these are also pointers for anybody who is reading journalism or any kind of audience.
Well, anybody who understands history or cares about history or cares about Indigenous peoples or cares about the state of the world. I mean, this seems natural for the Women's Media Center because it is so rooted in righteous journalism. I mean, in other words, in fair. You have to see it to be it. You have to. There's nothing about this subject that couldn't be remedied by lots more Native American journalists in newsrooms. I mean, because if they were there, they would be de facto educating about their communities, about the differences, frankly, between their communities, about their communities in where there's overlap. I mean, all of this should be of interest to anybody in mass communication and in scholars of journalism or Indigenous studies or media studies. So this is amazing what you've done. I mean, this is really just super. I always knew you were a good journalist, and but this is something else. This is really congratulations, Cristina.
Well, thank you. I do want to just very briefly give the honor to my great-grandmother. So the book cover is a picture of a turkey feather mantle, which is basically a cape. And it was made by my great-grandmother, Molly Holmes Adams. And so when I was looking for an image for the book cover, I wanted to honor the many women in my past who got me to the point where I could write this book, and the number of women whose voices are in this book and the voices that came through to me while I was writing this book. And so I asked this kid is in a museum in Virginia, and I asked him if they could have a good picture of this, they could send me to use the image. And then I was so happy to be able to put that on the cover. No questions asked, even though it has nothing to do with the book, but everything to do with why the book was birthed eventually. And then there's a picture of my great-grandmother and Molly Holmes Adams, who made it in the dedication to the book. And the book is dedicated to all the women who really made me who I am. And so I think that that's important for the Women's Media Center, is we're all products of the women who were resilient and fought, and often fought with their lives to make sure that we could tell our stories.
Well, you are so right. And those stories, we live in those stories, and those stories live in us. So you have added greatly to the story cabinet, my dear. And again, I congratulate you. Thank you so much, Cristina. Thank you for writing this book and lasting through the process, and finding a way to expand it beyond academia that would be of use to anybody who cared about anything, really. So thank you for the rest of us. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Robin, for having me on. And it was so wonderful to talk to you again after all these years.
We have to take one last break here, but I'll be back directly with some fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Sequoia, the state that never was. Those are fighting words. A few weeks ago, the state legislature of Oklahoma passed the most draconian anti-reproductive rights law in this nation, in effect granting tissues of the fetus personhood. Never mind Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway musical, the state of Oklahoma has its own bloody history. As Aaron Blakemore wrote some time ago in National Geographic, Oklahoma originally was called Sequoia, the Choctaw term for red people. But Oklahoma's nickname, the Sooner State, comes from white settlers who swarmed to it to claim native lands. In July of 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that despite its location inside a U.S. state, almost all of eastern Oklahoma is an Indian reservation. This was a landmark decision, and it was the latest foray in a battle over who should own and inhabit Oklahoma's prairies and mesas. The conflict was born in the southeastern United States, the ancestral lands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole peoples that spanned from modern-day North Carolina to Mississippi. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, the white settlers who flooded the area named these 5 native nations, quote, the 5 civilized tribes, close quote. This insulting term was due to their willingness to develop economic and social ties with the whites. Nonetheless, the white newcomers pressured the U.S. government to push them off their lands. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which allowed then-President Andrew Jackson to grant Native American tribes land out west, supposedly in exchange for their ancestral lands. Under great duress, the 5 tribes signed a variety of treaties ceding their lands in exchange for promises like an 1833 treaty that guaranteed, quote, a permanent home to the whole Creek Nation, close quote. Still, many refused. These were ancestral lands. Their dead were buried there. Generations upon generations had lived and died there, raised families. So they resisted, and they were driven from their homes at gunpoint. Between 1830 and 1850, more than 100,000 Indigenous Americans were relocated. This was the forced migration known as the Trail of Tears. Their destination, their new home, was located 1,000 miles away, the area west of the Mississippi and east of the Rockies. Different climate, water table, soil, flora and fauna, neighboring tribes, different everything. Yet there they settled onto land in what is now central and eastern Oklahoma, alongside 21 other tribes. But over the years, the U.S. claimed more native land, and Indian territory shrank to roughly the boundaries of modern-day Oklahoma. It then shrank even further when the U.S. switched from a policy of removal to one of allotment, a system designed to force native assimilation by dividing their traditional communal lands, overseen by tribal governments, into small, individually owned properties. Lands were carved into tiny portions and doled out to individuals, many of whom were pressured by poverty to sell their shares to white settlers or to the U.S. government. Settlers also tried to take over the area called so-called unassigned lands, 2 million-acre swaths of central Oklahoma that the U.S. had forced the Muskogee and the Seminoles, who had sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, to give up more than a decade earlier. Boomers, would-be settlers, squatted on the land and lobbied hard, so the federal government finally agreed to open it to white settlement in 1889. 50,000 white settlers flooded into surrounding areas waiting for the land to open on April 22, 1889. Some illegally entered beforehand, thus the nickname Sooners. In a single day, about 11,000 homesteads were claimed by whites. A little more than a year later, the federal government created Oklahoma Territory from the unassigned lands and the western Oklahoma lands. White settlers were eager to turn the territory into a state to gain representation in Congress. But the settlers and Congress were split on how to proceed, and as debate raged on, whites continued flooding into Oklahoma and into Indian territory, eventually far outnumbering native residents. The federal government cleared the way for statehood in 1898 with the Curtis Act, which announced that tribal governments would be abolished in March 1906, and which forced the 5 tribes to accept the allotment law from which they'd actually been exempt earlier. In a desperate attempt to retain sovereignty, the tribes held a convention to form a state of their own. In August and September 1905, they drafted a constitution and a government for a proposed Native American governed state they called Sequoia. But though referendum in Indian Territory passed by an overwhelming margin of both Native and white voters, Congress never voted on the issue. Instead, Congress passed the Oklahoma Enabling Act of 1906, a new law that invited representatives to become a state that combined Oklahoma and Indian territories. In 1907, Oklahoma became the nation's 46th state. Today, more than 13% of Oklahomans are Native American. Oklahoma has the second highest number of Native Americans of any state, and the state has 33 tribes operating 143 Indian casinos and gaming centers located across 50 Oklahoma counties, including the largest casino of all. Do you still wonder why? Sequoia, the state that never was. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. Senior advisor for this episode, Rebecca Adamson, Cherokee Nation, founder of First Peoples Worldwide. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.